The next speaker I am about to announce is also on that list of Republican Liberty Caucus endorsees, and that, of course, is Terri McCormick. Terri McCormick is a small businesswoman who, with her husband, owns a public relations and publishing company. She's an author of the book, What Sex is a Republican? A former three-term state legislator running for Congress against one of the guys we most desperately need to get rid of, Dr. Steve Kagan, over in CD8, Green Bay, Appleton, all the way to the Michigan border, if I remember correctly. Terri, the microphone is yours.
Welcome to the first, but not the last, Campaign for Liberty Conference. Let's give each other a round of applause. Now, we have an interesting path ahead of us in these coming elections. As proud Americans, it's hard to believe that the once covert Cold War has taken center stage in our own country. But it has. Now it's center stage here in our fight for our liberties, freedoms, and our constitutional way of life. As a citizen leader, author, self-term limited legislator, I've been in that war for almost 15 years, and yes, I am that old. I've got the glasses and bifocals to prove it. As a mother, I'm fearful, just as so many parents are, for their children and for the opportunities and for the way of life that we have been able to enjoy in this country. Today, it's suddenly cool for candidates to come across your stage and tell you that they're against big spending, they're against earmarks, they know what the terminology is, and they know what to say before the crowds. But what I'd like to ask all of you to do is to ask all of them, what were they doing between 2000 and 2008 when Republicans were in charge? Let me tell you what I was doing. In 2000, I was running a successful educational consulting business because parents and students weren't getting the basic literacy skills. Because I was asked to write government and political science curriculums, coach mock trial teams in the parochial schools, and to step it up to make sure that No Child Left Behind wasn't a theory. It was No Child Left Behind because adults are accountable for the children in their classroom and their learning. In 2001 to 2006, I self-term limited before I began in the Wisconsin State Legislature. I believed in term limits, I believe in constitutional principles, and I wanted to walk my talk. While I was there, we had a lot of success because we formed grassroots coalitions across my state house seat and throughout the state of Wisconsin, with small business owners, with families, with individuals who identified problems. Let me share some of the major reforms that we were able to write and pass into law. The first Small Business Regulation Reform Act that pushed back the bureaucracies from small businesses and proved to legislators that, yes, the people are only safe when the legislature is out of session. It required all legislators to write an economic impact statement before they could pass any law that would affect business or jobs. Another reform, we enacted the competitive prescription drug purchasing pool for state employees. I chaired that subcommittee of healthcare reform, and I used a business model to put those ideas together. You know, define the problem, look for private sector solutions, let free market enterprise solve the problem and get government off the back. It works. I worked to expand public charter school law. It was a law I was rather fond of. In 1994, I wrote it. Was the first private sector president of the Wisconsin Charter School Association, and I have the arrows in my back to prove it, believe me. Lastly, the bill I'm most proud of was to get a property tax rebate from 100% combat disabled veterans in this country. There are freedom fighters here among us. If you're a veteran, I thank you. As someone who comes from a family of veterans and has felt the sacrifice and the ultimate sacrifice of a nephew, I thank all of you. Now, I'd like to say that my Republican leadership front row was with me and cheering me on and helping me to get those reforms and bills passed, but I would be telling a fib. My Irish grandmother would not have that. I wouldn't toe their line. I didn't agree to the deals behind the scenes, and I built coalitions with conservative members in both caucuses because we had to get something done, and I was about ready to get something done for my constituents. Under my leadership as chair of the Economic Development Committee, we saw a spike. We saw something unusual for the first time in Wisconsin legislative politics. Our economy actually improved, and it spiked in 05 and 06, all to the hard work of small business owners who cheered me on with the Small Business Regulation Reform Act, who cheered me on to make sure that we toppled over the Capco monopolies so that we had capital flowing in on a competitive basis to business and industry that grew jobs. My vision today for this nation, running for the United States House of Representatives, same as yours. Same as every freedom-loving American. We need smaller government. It's too expensive. We can't afford it. How can we have capital to invest in small businesses and grow jobs if we're paying all the freight for a bloated government that does nothing but encroach on your freedoms and liberties?
That's right.
I know it's a surprise to some folks in power, but government doesn't create jobs. We laugh here, but you go to Washington and you go into the inner circles of Madison and they don't understand that small, simple fact.
Maybe of China.
Unfortunately, with the Obama health care scheme that has just passed, you have heard many, many speakers refer to, and not threaten and not provide fear, but to guarantee you that we will have 16,000 new employed IRS agents very willing to figure out if you've bought the right shoe for the right foot that doesn't fit your foot anymore because you don't get to choose your health care. We've got to change that. And if I'm elected to Congress, the first thing I'm going to do is repeal this nonsense. The United States needs a government that promotes free market enterprise. That's been the spirit and the engine of this country all along. We need to get it back. That's why we need to win these elections. You know, Ron Paul has an excellent idea. Let's audit the Federal Reserve. Isn't it time we figured out who's making decisions and on whose behalf so that the American people get more of their own tax money back in their pocket where it belongs? Limited government requires that taxpayers receive the full value of every dollar that is spent. It's your money. It's not people elected into public office, and it's time that we made sure that everybody in Washington and Madison understood that fact. I'd like to talk a little bit about my race in northern Wisconsin, northeast Wisconsin to be precise, in the 8th Congressional District. We all know that we're at a tipping point in American history. We all know that you all are making history today. I'm running against a guy by the name of Dr. Steve Kagan. I have a few primary opponents too, but we'll get there. Dr. Steve Kagan is the Triple Crown winner. Now, my grandfather helped to train sulky racehorses, Morgans, in northern Minnesota, but he never had the Triple Crown winner to run against that I have. Dr. Kagan voted for the stimulus package. He voted for cap and trade and is proud of that vote. Now, this is where it gets interesting. As he was holding teletown conference meetings in the 8th Congressional District, not knowing how he was going to vote. He didn't know how he was going to vote. But his colleagues in Washington on the U.S. House floor were telling me that he was arm twisting to get everybody to step in line with the health care bill. And he was taking full responsibility for it on the House floor. Well, you know, when you've got a politician who says one thing and does another and doesn't have an Irish grandmother, there's only one exit that you can point, and that's the door. There are clear philosophical differences before all of these congressional and Senate seats before us. And with your help, we can challenge them to think in the right perspective. Let's take a look at these philosophies and see if they match up to you. Instead of supporting competition, they're for bailouts and pork barrel spending. Instead of supporting pro-growth policies, pro-free market competition policies, they're for tightening capital by printing and printing more and more money. Instead of opening the market for freedom, government giveaways to the Middle East to grow trees under the cap and trade that's been passed in the House, and a deficit of $14 trillion seems to make sense for all of the folks in Washington, D.C. Does it make sense for you? No. Let's take a look at the issues that we've been talking about all over Northeast Wisconsin. One of them is the 10th Amendment. Yes, the people that I hope to represent not only read the Constitution, they quiz me on it. Isn't that a refreshing thought? The 10th Amendment was put in place by the founders who were extremely wise for one reason. They knew, due to the tyranny of the colonies by the British, by the United Kingdom, at that time it was the British Empire, they knew that they should be fearful of a too powerful government. They knew that powers delegated to the states needed to be in place in order to protect their individual freedoms and liberties. Well, it seems like we need a history lesson to take place in the U.S. House of Representatives, and you and I are about to give it to them. We need to return to those 10th Amendment principles. Another issue they talk about in Northeast Wisconsin in the 8th Congressional District is sovereignty. Now, sovereignty can mean a whole lot of different things to a whole lot of different people. It can be the United States government shouldn't have other world powers telling it what to do. It could mean that the United States' self-interest and national interest isn't all around the world trying to take over the entire world as an empire. It could mean the 10th Amendment and making sure sovereignty of the states is intact. But I'd like to talk to you about individual sovereignty. I believe in individual sovereignty and individual liberties, and that's why I'm running for the U.S. House of Representatives today. That means that every man, woman, child, and unborn child has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's what I'm talking about. You know, our civil liberties have not only been under attack, we're not guessing about these things, but we have had a U.S. House that since the Patriot Act and other pieces of legislation have forgotten that their first and primary responsibility is to read the bills before them and to ensure that the United States Constitution stayed intact. They haven't. I pledge to all of you today, lovers of liberty and freedom, that I won't sign, pass, or do anything unless I've actually read the bill. Other issues we're talking about is the war. I not only support the fact that we should have constitutional wars, I will do everything I can to reinforce the Constitution that before we go to war, we should declare war, and that can only come from the Constitution and the Congress. I'm concerned that our United States military is stretched over 130 countries. I'm I'm concerned that when they come home, we're not standing with our military troops and our veterans that come home that need our support. And the only way to rectify that and the concerns for the deficit and the economic problems is to make sure that we have individuals worthy of leadership going into the U.S. House as worthy as the soldiers and the leaders on the battlefield who are protecting our freedoms. Now, you knew that we wouldn't get by this little discussion, even though I only have 15 to 20 minutes, without talking a little bit about health care. The free market solutions to our health care cost, and I'm going to emphasize cost crisis, will not be handled in the nonsense that has just been passed without a bill intact that is so constitutionally challenged that we have at least 20 states already filing against the United States government on your behalf. In 2002, just to give a track record so that you know what I say is going to match out what I've done. In 2002, in putting together that competitive prescription drug purchasing pool, we held hearings all over the state of Wisconsin to get ideas, so we could identify the problems. Those of you in private business, don't you identify the problems first before you charge in and try to do top-down management to tell everybody what to do? We all know that the best ideas come from the ground up. They don't come from the top down. Well, we were able to put together a competitive bid prescription drug purchasing pool, and because of politics, because that's the world we live in, it was only allowed to relate to 2% of the state employees. Do you know how much cost savings we had for 2% of the state employees with competition that works? $25 million. Can you imagine if it would go over 100% of state employees and all local governments, what competition would do to bring down the cost of prescription drugs under your tax-paying wallet? We've got to use free market principles to clean up the waste, fraud, and abuse that threatens this nation more than any dictator ever would. That's what we'll use for jobs. The number one crisis right now is the damage done to our economy because we've forgotten that the private sector creates jobs. We need to, number one, make sure our dollar means something, and to make sure our monetary system is intact. Number one, that's why auditing the Fed is so critical at this time. We need to make sure we have less regulation and not more. We need to make sure the IRS is not growing by any number. In fact, I would argue for just stop spending. Wouldn't that be refreshing? If you send people in to just say no to spending. We're fighting a mindset today. A mindset that, one, either government can solve every single problem that you have, and by the way, they're going to charge you for it, or two, favors for votes, greed and corruption. And that, my friends, is a bipartisan sport. I disagree with the nonsense of both of those thinking. Government cannot solve every problem, and in fact, government is the problem to most of the problems this country has. I will stand up to both of those ridiculous ideas. And I've made a pledge, we'll put it on the website, and it says, my votes will not be for sale. I will work on the core principles that we need in place. Not only limited government, which should be paramount, but the principles under the Constitution, but also the rule of law. Most of the problems today would be cleaned up if lawmakers would just obey the laws. Education is always an important issue. It's always an important issue. It's why I went out into the private sector and started the businesses I did. But I'll tell you one thing. It doesn't take a village to raise a family. It takes a family to raise its children. And that means we need free market competition so that parents and children have the best choices in either homeschooling, parochial schooling, voucher schools, charter schools, or whatever they decide is the best fit to educate their own children. Now I'm going to get back to cap and tax. My general opponent was proud of his vote on cap and trade. You know, the bill that planted all those trees in Saudi Arabia? They did. It's in there. 1,300 pages of nonsense. He's proud of that vote. That'll penalize small businesses by more government interference after layer after layer after layer, because that's the bill they're going to take up next after the health care nonsense. The Senate is going to take up cap and tax because they haven't had enough time to dig into one of your pockets. They found a hole in there. You're running out of money, you guys, I guess. So they put their hand in the other pocket until you can say no. We're going to be saying no come the fall elections in September, and especially in the November elections of 2010, we're going to all say no. I will make sure to expose any hidden or flagrant tax hiking proposal for what it is. Cap and trade is just that. Obama health care threatens our elderly the most. I am just starting to dig into the paperwork to really identify how many cuts are going to be coming around the corner and how many decisions are going to be taken away from our elderly. And I'm getting up in age, so I'm getting close to that 65 watermark. So I want to make sure for our children and our grandchildren that we restore freedom and free principles in this country so that we can get government back on track the way the Founding Fathers had intended it to be. I'm standing here as a candidate for the United States House of Representatives. Representatives is the operative word. It is the first article of the United States Constitution for a reason, because we're supposed to be accountable as representatives to the people of this great country, and that is you. Now, I must tell you one last thing before I close, and that is without your help times 100, and this is a terrific place to start, but without your help, in these primary elections, which are key elections, the primaries, you will choose whether or not a machine candidate gets through the primary that will follow the leader, fall in line, and do as they're told, more earmarks, more of the same, or if you will get a representative of, by, and for the people that'll stand up and make sure that your liberties and your constitutional rights are not taken away. We need you in the primaries. If you do not get involved in these primaries against machine candidates, I guarantee nothing will change. We may change jerseys on the baseball field, but the game will be the same. What we need are game changers, and that's why the Campaign for Liberty is critical to this nation. In our fight for freedom, in our fight for the United States Constitution, I ask all of you to stand up. I ask everyone in this room to raise your lantern for light and liberty. Hold us all accountable so that together we can restore this great nation. Thank you very much.